She was the mother of all living, also that God made the first sacrifice and to show them, hey, this is the consequences of sin. Doug.
There could be a little bit of symbolism in that.
Sure.
In that Jesus' sacrifice covers our sins.
Oh, yeah.
That sacrifice covered their bodies.
Yeah, 100%. As a matter of fact, there's sermons on it, on just that idea. Because when something is the first of anything, I feel it really stands out. And I feel that idea is really explicit here. If you think about it, the idea that Doug just mentioned there, the similarities between the covering of the animals and the covering of Jesus' sacrifice for our atonement. Good thoughts. Any others? Okay. Cain and Abel. Let's go ahead and read that. That's Genesis chapter 4, verses 4 through 8. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Some questions. Why did they make these offerings? Why'd they do it? Do we have a record of God telling them to do it? Oh yeah. I'm sorry. What?
Yeah, God told him.
Yeah, that's. I believe, and we're gonna ask this question, over again, because it only happens a few times where we see in these early chapters of the Bible where people are making sacrifices, but we never heard God tell them to make them. But even the fact alone that God, he liked one and didn't like the other, I think is a good kind of highlight of the fact that there was something that he expected them to do, and the way he expected them to do it, that they did not, that Cain did not ultimately come to pass, and that leads me into my next point here. Well, first of all, what was the substance of their offerings? They had different responsibilities. Cain was a tiller of the ground, and Abel, he took care of the flock. So they gave different offerings. So Cain gave stuff of the ground, stuff that he works with, and it says Abel gave of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. Okay? Nothing out of the ordinary, things that we've seen in scriptures. But there is a highlight, I believe, in just this wording here, that it appears that Abel, it's not that he gave, I don't think it's that he gave, again, there's some verses that we're going to read in a minute, but just superficially looking at it, it appears that he gave just extra. He gave the best. He gave the fat portions, the firstlings. And those are some ideas that are later highlighted when it's actually a command. So again, either Abel had some insight or it was something that was already known that you give the best and what that best means. It seems that Abel understood that. Why was Cain's sacrifice not regarded by the Lord? Wasn't his best? That's definitely true. Any other thoughts?
Specifically, according to Hebrews 11, was not what God told him to do. Whatever God told him to do, it wasn't that.
Yeah. Doug, you want to finish your thoughts there?
It didn't make the standard that God required.
He didn't make the standard that God required. That's obvious. Yeah, I do believe, again, when something's highlighted and the other one's not, it's kind of like the idea where God loved Jacob and hated Esau. You know, you can really see the highlight in the fact that Abel had such a good sacrifice and Cain gave from fruit of the ground. Real quick, Doug, he brought up Hebrews 11, and I think one of the answers to this is also he lacked faith. Hebrews 11 says, by verse 4, if you want to turn there, by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained a testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. So by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. So here's this idea that is throughout time that we'll see over and over again. They are both physically doing something. But what's important to God? The heart. The heart. From the very beginning, in the very first sacrifice, we see man giving to God. We see that number one things on God's mind is, what's your heart look like? What's your faith in the things that you're doing?
I think you already alluded to this, but I think also there's something that we see in verse 4 that was missing in verse 3. Verse 4, Abel also brought up the firstborn of his flock. All we see in verse 3 is that Cain brought offerings.
Yeah.
You talked about the first fruits. I think that was what was missing myself. I think that's why his offering was not accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. His description of his occupation is a description of his offering. Cain, he tilled the ground, he worked the ground, and he gave an offering from the ground. And you think it would say, if it was equivalent, Abel works in the flock, and he gave of his flock. But no, it goes into detail showing how his sacrifice was his effort to give his best. Doug?
My impression is that Cain gave him the leftovers.
Mm-hmm.
After he'd already enjoyed whatever he wanted to, then he gave to God.
Yeah.
He was just checking the box.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen today, does it?
Yeah, and I believe that what Doug pointed out, what I believe, is that, Cain's wasn't a sacrifice. It was something that he gave.
Right.
Where Abel's was, he actually sacrificed something
Mm-hmm.
that was value to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I believe that's where the Hebrews 4 comes in, the lack of faith. He gave, but he didn't sacrifice.
Yeah.
Like, if I was gonna give you something, say I have 2 iPads, I'm probably gonna keep the better one for myself and give you the one that's older or whatever.
Mhm.
That seems to be, as Larry said, what Cain probably did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this idea is brought over and over again throughout scriptures. So once it becomes a command, once it becomes something that's normal and understood, that very thought is ingrained in it. And we see from the very beginning, half-hearted sacrifice, half-hearted, faithless type of offerings was never acceptable by God. There.
I think it's important to establish where faith comes from. If we're just saying that Cain had a better heart, better intentions, then the standard is subjective. But Romans 10:17 tells us that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So you had asked the question earlier, did God tell them? Well, we don't see it explicitly, but Hebrews tells us that Abel did it by faith. Where does faith come from? Only by what God tells us and in us following. And so somewhere God had to instruct them, and we know that because Abel did it by faith. And I think the Bible's absolutely clear that faith comes from the instruction of God. In other words, to know how I respond to God can only come from God himself. And either I respond to that in a good way, an honest way, in a loving way, or I don't. And if I don't do that, if I don't react to that instruction, that's not of faith.
Good point.
Cain is probably the first example of what we hear all the time today. I think this would please God. What I think, not what he requires.
Yeah, definitely. Great points. Darren had brought up, there's this subjective idea of faith. He had a better faith, better heart. Let's go to 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. This is why I love teaching, is because I have to dig deeper into these things, and then I find things that I forgot about. And this is one of those verses, Hebrews 11:4 and 1 John 3:11 and 12. It says, "For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous." It's a funny thing about faith and deeds. If you've paid attention long enough, the people you see that lose faith are typically the people who are enjoying doing what we would consider evil deeds, living of the world. Then all of a sudden, they're not sure about certain verses. And then all of a sudden, certain compromises are put into place. When our desires come above what we know to be true about God and his word. So I believe that's it. I believe those are the three things. I believe his sacrifice within itself, and the physicalness of the sacrifice was not up to par, was not of his best. I think we can see that when we compare the way Abel's is described compared to how his is described. And looking at these verses in the New Testament, he also lacked faith, we see in Hebrews, and also was living a life where he did evil deeds and his brothers were righteous. Jealousy is a terrible thing. From the very beginning, we see God is not impressed with the ritualistic, going through the motions type of offering and sacrifices, but desires a faithful heart. Any other thoughts on that? All right. Next, we're going to talk about Noah's sacrifice. Noah's sacrifice. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 8 and start reading in verses 15. What time does the bell start ringing? Is it 40? Okay. Genesis 8, verses 15 through 22. Then I'm going to read one verse in chapter 9. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by their families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Chapter 9, verse 11. I establish my covenant with you. You, all flesh, shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh. And never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So here's this question again. Why did Noah do it? Why did he have a sacrifice? And again, it's the same idea. We don't see a command, is basically what I'm asking. Did God command this? We don't see it. We don't see anything like this. What did he sacrifice? What did he sacrifice? And I didn't realize the depth of the sacrifice as well. I just remember him making a sacrifice. But again, going over it again, he sacrificed of all the clean animals. It doesn't give a number, but my impression of it, the way that it's worded, is that he sacrificed. It says, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So it appears that he sacrificed probably one of each clean animal, all of them. That's probably why God knew he said take extra of the clean ones. So I mean, you can really see. There's something about this sacrifice that I found really intriguing. I feel really applies to us today. What had just happened? What? He just survived the flood. How long was he on that ark? About a year, right? What does he do as soon, I mean, it goes from one verse to the next. What does he do as soon as he gets his family and all the animals off the altar? I mean, I just give the answer away in the question. Yeah. Immediately after getting himself and his family and the animals off the ark, he builds an altar to worship God, to give thanks to God. And it makes me think, what an amazing example that Noah did for us, if you really think about it. He just went through all this, just lost so many people. He was on an ark for, about a year. It doesn't sound like, he keeps checking, like, is it still out there? Is it still? And finally, he can get off the ark, and he builds an altar and worships God. And I saw Doug with his hand up.
I don't think we appreciate the massiveness of this as well, and the amount of blood that was spilled.
Mm-hmm.
He had a slaughterhouse going, just him and his sons, doing all these sacrifices. It wasn't an hour operation. This took a lot of time.
Yeah.
And just all the blood, from the very beginning, blood and the shedding of blood, the visibleness of it. I think we miss out on that. I don't want to go back to having sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
I think we miss in our minds a lot of times how much blood was actually shed because of sin.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he talks about the time. Who knows how long that? Maybe it took over. Maybe he had stayed up all night. I mean, I don't know how many animals were physically, counting them on the earth at that time. But of all the clean animals, sacrificed one of them. It was truly a feat, and truly a bloody feat. And that's actually something that we're going to come across, because I feel we lose it, as Doug mentioned, as when we think about sacrifice and when we think about the consequences of sin. How what are the wages of sin? We see in the New Testament, it hasn't changed, Old Testament, New Testament. The wages of sin is death. And some of this imagery we're going to be seeing more, and hopefully we can draw some connections and see how it applies to us. Real quick, what do we learn? What do we learn about stress, and what do we learn about being put in such a tremendous amount, just in a tremendous situation? Again, first thing you do is worship God. We could be in utter chaos. We might have to start over. I mean, some people during this pandemic, they had to start over. You know, they just opened a business. Everything is planned out, and all of a sudden they can't work anymore, and they have to start over. And Noah had to start over. And first thing he does is what? Something we see in the New Testament. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And I think that's something that we can really focus on, that his priority when getting out of the ark, after being on it a year, after experiencing everything, was to worship God. And again, you have a sense of, you can feel the gratitude, the thankfulness, and he was spared, and he taken care of.
You see that he was truly humble here.
Mm-hmm.
Probably thought to himself, who am I that you save me and my family?
Mm-hmm.
Take me through this great ordeal and then deliver me back to safety. I mean, he's truly humble.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a humbling experience. You can really get that there. Did God accept his sacrifice? Yeah, he did. How do we know? It's pleasing aroma. You know, it's interesting. I always find the wording, because it happens throughout scriptures, and it's always, I always have this mind about God where everything's made up. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, certain ways. And of course that comes down to doctrine and what we see in the scriptures. But it's always interesting to see, and this is one of those, where it seems like God made a decision based on something that one man did, or one man said, or one man thought. And that's what it appears to be here in Genesis. It seems like after he makes this sacrifice here, let's see, how's it worded here? He built an offering, and then he says, the Lord smelled, in verse 21, the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Yeah, God accepted the sacrifice. He knew, he knew, looking at what we know about Cain and Abel, and what made Abel's sacrifice good. We knew that Noah had the same intention, the same heart, the same attitude was going into it, that God appreciated, and it was a pleasing aroma to him. And we know from other scriptures that it's not the sacrifice. God doesn't care necessarily for the blood of bulls and the blood of rams and things like that. What's important to God is what's going into this sacrifice. And it was a pleasing aroma to God, so much so that he made a covenant with him. And what's this covenant? All the kids are familiar with this, I'm sure. I'm sure they've studied it over and over again. But it's important, and I think it's important for a couple of reasons. What's this covenant? Never destroy the earth by flood again. I think it's also, he's never going to destroy the earth with flood again. He put a rainbow in the cloud, right? The sign of a covenant. We've got the rainbow, and what a beautiful rainbow it is, and it kind of makes me sad. You know why? Because honestly, I love rainbows. You know, I love, they're cool, you know, they're colorful, you know, it's nice. It makes me think of God, but rainbows has been taken captive, hasn't it?
Oh, that bunch of perverts. Something beautiful and something that means something to us, and to destroy that image is a lot of people's minds. It's disgusting.
Yeah, you know, I think Satan has a twisted sense of humor sometimes, because I feel like this is not, if not one of the first, because I do think God mentions a covenant to him before he builds the ark, but this is one of the first covenants, and its sign is a rainbow. And he says, he goes, when I look at this cloud, I'm gonna remember. When I look at this rainbow, I'm gonna remember what I did and what I'm not going to do again when I look at this rainbow. And I think it trickles down to us as Christians, as believers in the Bible, that when we think of rainbow, what we should think about is God's promise, God's covenant to us. And it reminds us. And here's a couple of things I think it reminds us of. Number one, God makes promises to his people. Number two, he loves us, and he's not going to, we could think of it, he's not going to destroy with water anymore. But number three, I think it is a stark reminder that God destroyed the world because of sin in the past. And I think it's a stark reminder that, again, sin has consequences. And I think that's something we're going to see as we continue to study sacrifices and offering, is that sin has consequences. And when we look at that rainbow, I think it's a highlight again to the fact that the world was so evil that God decided to destroy it and start over. But again, it's a sad thing, as we mentioned, it's a sad thing that it has been taken hostage. And now, if you like rainbows, if you wanted to wear a rainbow, you're actually saying something else, or at least it'll be interpreted as something else. When the rainbow was ours, the rainbow is ours. It hasn't changed. It still is. It's just it's been hijacked. Yeah.
Your next point. So, on that ark represented all of creation. All of life was on the ark. All that God had created was defiled before the flood. God cleansed the world. What was left was on the ark. And then Noah sacrifices, in essence, almost all of life, at least that representatives of all of life in that thing. And so God makes a covenant, not just with man, but with all of creation. I mean, he says specifically with man, and he talks about the sanctity of life, that type of thing, but he also mentions the covenant in verse 9, with you and your descendants, and then with every living creature that is with you, the birds and the cattle, the beasts. It's God's determination to restore his creation back to man. It's going to take time, and ultimately it's going to take Christ to be able to do that. But it is what God had in mind from the very, very beginning of time, to have this creation and be able, in spite of sin, to provide a way for that to continue to exist. I think it's just a beautiful, it's a great passage.
Yeah, definitely.
Something I would overlook a lot when you talk about this is that God has set them up to be able to make those sacrifices. If you go back to chapter 7, in Genesis, in verse 2, it says, "You shall take with you every clean animal by sevens." So the clean, he actually took 7 of each clean animal, and the others, the unclean, he took 2.
Yeah.
So in the end, God helped her. You see the sacrifice, maybe it's not mentioned, but you can see God kind of helping set up the field.
Yeah. I mean, is there any difference from what we see today? You know, a lot of things we think God is not involved in our lives. You know, we've got the Bible, we've got his word, but I believe God puts things in our lives for us to make the right decisions. You know, Noah didn't have to sacrifice, or he made that choice, is what I believed. I don't think he was, so God said, hey, make this sacrifice. Same thing in our lives. We have choices that we make every day that I believe God sets up for us. Are you going to make this right decision? I set it up for you. So that's something to think about as well, that we see God kind of working in the background a little bit, providing him the ability to make these sacrifices. Otherwise, if it was just two, what are you going to have to wait a little bit for them to make some more? But listen, I'm really excited to be teaching this class. I do believe that we're going to all come out of here feeling like we appreciate Christ and his sacrifice even more. There's certain concepts that I think we're going to get into when it comes to our sacrifices that we make that I think we're all going to be have a better picture of what that means. And I'm sure a lot of you already know, but I feel that this is one of the things that has been throughout Scripture from the very beginning, possibly even with God putting skins on Adam and Eve, this idea of necessary sacrifice, of a covering of the consequences of sin and God's promises. And I appreciate your attention and your comments. And unless there's another question or comment, that's all I have for today. Thank you. Keep everybody surprised. I say